If you're planning to move to Australia, everything you thought you knew about the migration system just became obsolete. The rules that worked last month, the pathways that seemed guaranteed, the visa categories that thousands relied on, they're being dismantled right now as we speak. December 2025 marks the most radical overhaul of Australian immigration policy in over 2 decades, and if you don't understand what's happening, your dreams of living in Australia could evaporate before your eyes. This isn't a minor policy tweak. This is a complete reconstruction of who gets in, who stays out, and what you need to prove to even have a chance. The old game is over, and the new rules are brutal, selective, and designed to exclude far more people than they accept. Welcome to Aussie Global Affairs, your essential source for cutting-edge analysis of Australian immigration, policy changes, and global mobility trends. I'm here to cut through the government spin, decode the bureaucratic language, and give you the unfiltered truth about what these changes mean for your future in Australia. Today, we're breaking down the new selective migration system that just came into effect this December, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll know exactly where you stand, what your options are, and most importantly, what immediate action you need to take if you want any chance of making Australia your home. The Australian government has just announced what they're calling the skills-based selective migration framework, and that sanitized terminology hides a revolution in how immigration decisions are made. Gone is the points-based system that has been the backbone of skilled migration for decades. Gone are many of the occupation lists that skilled workers relied on. Gone is the relatively straightforward pathway from temporary visa to permanent residence that millions have followed. In their place is a system so complex, so restrictive, and so heavily weighted towards specific industries and skill sets that the majority of people who would have qualified under the old rules will now find themselves completely shut out. Let's start with the most shocking change, and that's the introduction of dynamic occupation targeting. Under the old system, Australia published medium and long-term strategic skills lists, occupation lists that told you whether your profession was in demand. If your occupation was on the list, you could apply. Simple. Predictable. The new system abolishes these static lists entirely. Instead, the government will now use real-time labor market data, regional employment statistics, and industry-specific demand projections to create what they're calling fluid occupation windows. What does that mean in practice? It means that whether your occupation is eligible can change month to month, week to week, or even day to day based on algorithmic assessments of labor market needs. This creates a nightmare scenario for potential migrants. You could spend months preparing your application, gathering documents, getting your skills assessed, paying thousands of dollars in fees, only to find that by the time you're ready to submit, your occupation has been moved out of the current demand window and you're no longer eligible. There's no warning, no transition period, no grandfather clause protecting applications in progress. The government's position is that this dynamic system allows them to respond in real time to Australia's actual needs, rather than relying on outdated annual reviews of occupation lists. The reality for migrants is chaos, uncertainty, and a system where planning becomes almost impossible. The second major change involves what the government is calling sectoral allocation quotas. Australia has always had an overall migration cap, a maximum number of permanent residence visas issued each year. But within that cap, different visa categories competed relatively freely. If one category was undersubscribed, others could potentially use that allocation. The new system divides the migration program into rigid sectoral quotas. Healthcare gets a specific allocation, information technology gets another, engineering gets a third, hospitality and tourism get a fourth, though dramatically smaller than before. And here's the critical part. These quotas are not just guidelines, they're absolute ceilings. And once a sector reaches its quota for the year, that pathway closes completely until the next allocation period. What makes this particularly devastating is how small some of these quotas are. The hospitality and retail sector, which used to bring in tens of thousands of workers annually, now has a combined quota of just 8,000 permanent residence visas per year for the entire country. Given that there are currently over 40,000 people on temporary work visas in these sectors hoping to transition to permanent residence, you can do the math. 80% of these people will not get through. They'll be forced to either leave Australia when their temporary visas expire or remain in a perpetual state of temporary residency with no pathway to permanence. The tech sector quota is more generous at 25,000, but with global competition for these visas and Australia's relatively lower salaries compared to North America, the question becomes whether the quota will even be filled. The third fundamental change is the introduction of mandatory regional conditioning for the majority of skilled migration streams. Australia has always had regional visa categories designed to encourage migration to areas outside the major cities of Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. But these were separate pathways, optional routes for people willing to live in regional areas in exchange for somewhat easier qualification criteria. The new system makes regional conditioning mandatory for approximately 60% of all skilled migration visas. What does that mean? It means that even if you're a highly qualified professional in a critical occupation, even if you have job offers from employers in Sydney or Melbourne, you will be required to live and work in a designated regional area for a minimum of 4 years before you can move to a major city while maintaining your visa status. The regional areas designated under this program are extensive and include places with limited job opportunities in many professional fields, harsh climates, and in some cases, significant distance from major services and infrastructure. The government argues this will boost regional development and reduce pressure on the major cities. The reality is that many skilled migrants will struggle to find appropriate employment in their fields in these regional areas, and the 4-year lock-in period is long enough that many will simply choose other countries with more flexible location requirements. Family impacts are severe as well, with limited educational options in some regional areas, reduced access to healthcare specialists, and isolation from established migrant communities that provide crucial support networks. The fourth major change involves a complete restructuring of the employer sponsorship system. Previously, Australian employers could sponsor overseas workers relatively straightforwardly if they could demonstrate that they couldn't find suitable Australian workers for the position. The testing requirements were manageable, the processing was reasonably efficient, and for many migrants, employer sponsorship was the most reliable pathway to Australian residence. The new system introduces what's called enhanced labor market testing with compliance penalties. Employers must now advertise positions for a minimum of 12 weeks across multiple platforms, including government job boards. Demonstrate that they interviewed at least 10 qualified Australian candidates. Provide detailed justification for why each of those candidates was unsuitable, and submit to random audits where the Department of Home Affairs can interview rejected candidates to verify the employer's assessment. But here's where it gets truly onerous. If an employer is found to have inadequately tested the labor market or to have rejected qualified Australian candidates without legitimate justification, they face penalties starting at $50,000 per violation, temporary or permanent bans from the sponsorship program, and potential public naming that can damage their reputation. The risk and administrative burden has become so significant that many small and medium businesses are simply opting out of overseas recruitment entirely. Large corporations have the resources to manage these requirements, but for the typical migrant who was hoping to get sponsored by a growing company or a regional employer, this pathway is becoming effectively closed. Additionally, the salary threshold for employer-sponsored positions has been dramatically increased. The temporary skilled migration income threshold, which was already raised significantly in recent years, is now being set at $98,000 annually for most occupations and $130,000 for positions in the major cities. These are substantial salaries that many employers, particularly in regional areas or in sectors like education or healthcare, simply cannot afford to pay. The government's stated purpose is to ensure that migration doesn't undercut wages for Australian workers, but the practical effect is to make employer sponsorship viable only for senior positions and highly specialized roles, cutting off what was once a major pathway for mid-level professionals. The fifth fundamental change, and perhaps the most controversial, is the introduction of cultural and linguistic integration prerequisites that go far beyond anything Australia has required before. Previously, most skilled migration visas required competent English, usually demonstrated through IELTS or equivalent tests with scores around 6 to 7. The new system introduces graduated English requirements based on occupation and intended location. Healthcare professionals must now demonstrate superior English with IELTS scores of 8 or higher across all components. Teachers and education professionals need similar levels. Even trades and technical occupations now require higher English standards than before, and here's the kicker. These tests must be taken in Australia at government-approved testing centers, and they must be retaken every 2 years to maintain visa status. But it goes beyond language. The new system requires completion of an Australian Values and Cultural Competency Program before permanent residence can be granted. This program, which takes approximately 40 hours to complete and costs $1,500, covers Australian history, political systems, workplace culture, social norms, and what the government describes as essential civic knowledge. At the end of the program, applicants must pass an examination with a minimum score of 85%, and there are only 3 attempts allowed. Fail all 3 attempts and your pathway to permanent residence is terminated, regardless of how many years you've lived and worked in Australia on temporary visas. Critics have pointed out that many native-born Australians would struggle to pass this examination, and that the content includes significant elements of subjective cultural interpretation rather than objective factual information. The government defends the program as ensuring that new migrants are well prepared to integrate into Australian society. The reality is that it creates another expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain barrier in what is already becoming an obstacle course of requirements. For migrants from non-English-speaking backgrounds, particularly those from Asian, African, or Middle Eastern countries, these combined language and cultural requirements represent a significant escalation in what's being demanded of them. Now, let's talk about the changes to family migration, because the impact here is equally severe. Australia's Family Migration Program, which allows Australian citizens and permanent residents to sponsor family members, has always been a significant component of the overall migration program. The new selective system has cut family migration allocations by 40%. The parent visa category, which was already heavily backlogged with wait times exceeding 20 years in some cases, now has an annual quota of just 7,000 places for the entire country. Given that there are over 100,000 applications currently in the queue, the mathematics are brutal. Most people who have applied for parent visas will never receive them. Their parents will age and die before their applications are processed. The partner visa program has also been restructured with new requirements that are raising serious concerns about equity and access. Previously, Australian citizens and permanent residents could sponsor their overseas partners through a relatively straightforward process that assessed the genuineness of the relationship. The new system adds financial capability requirements. Sponsors must now demonstrate that they earn at least $60,000 annually or have assets of at least $250,000 to be eligible to sponsor a partner. This financial threshold is ostensibly to ensure that sponsored partners won't become dependent on government welfare, but the practical effect is to make it impossible for younger Australians, casual workers, or people in lower income occupations to sponsor their partners. Consider a young Australian citizen working as a teacher, earning $55,000 a year, who falls in love with someone from another country. Under the old system, they could sponsor that partner. Under the new system, they cannot, unless they can somehow increase their income significantly or accumulate substantial assets. This creates a two-tier system where wealthier Australians can form families with international partners while working-class Australians cannot. The social implications are profound, and the human stories of separated couples are already generating significant media attention and political controversy. The business and investment migration program has undergone equally dramatic changes. Australia's business visas have long been criticized as essentially allowing wealthy individuals to buy their way into the country without necessarily contributing economically or integrating socially. The new system claims to address these concerns through much higher investment thresholds and mandatory job creation requirements. The lowest-tier business visa now requires an investment of $5 million, up from $1.5 million, and this investment must be maintained for a minimum of 5 years. Additionally, the visa holder must create at least 10 full-time jobs for Australian citizens or permanent residents within the first 2 years and maintain those jobs for the duration of their provisional visa period. For the premium investor visa, the threshold has been raised to $15 million with requirements to create 30 full-time jobs. These are extraordinarily high bars that put Australian business migration out of reach for all but the global ultra-wealthy. The government argues that if Australia is going to offer residence in exchange for investment, that investment should be substantial enough to create real economic benefit. The counter-argument is that many successful entrepreneurs and investors who could contribute significantly to the Australian economy are being shut out because they don't meet these extraordinarily high thresholds, while other countries with more reasonable business migration programs will attract these individuals instead. The changes to student pathways are equally significant and will fundamentally alter Australia's international education sector. International education has been one of Australia's largest export industries, bringing in billions of dollars annually and creating a pipeline of skilled migrants who study in Australia and then transition to work visas and eventually permanent residence. The new system severs this pipeline for most students. Completion of an Australian degree will no longer automatically grant access to post-study work rights unless that degree is in a critical skills area and the graduate secures employment in that field within 60 days of graduation at a salary above the skilled migration threshold. For the vast majority of international students studying business, commerce, arts, or humanities, this means their Australian qualifications will provide no pathway to remaining in the country. They will be required to leave upon graduation unless they can independently qualify for skilled migration, which for most will be impossible given the other restrictions we've discussed. The impact on Australia's education sector is predicted to be catastrophic, with projections suggesting a 40 to 60% decline in international student enrollments over the next 2 years as students choose countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, or New Zealand, where post-study work rights and pathways to residence remain more accessible. The humanitarian and refugee program has also been restructured, though this receives less attention in discussions of skilled migration. Australia's refugee intake has been maintained at approximately 14,000 places annually, but the composition has changed significantly. The emphasis is now heavily weighted toward refugees with skills that match Australia's economic needs, an approach that has been criticized by human rights organizations as fundamentally misunderstanding the purpose of refugee protection. The effect is that refugees from conflicts who lack formal qualifications or professional skills find it even harder to be resettled in Australia, while those with university degrees or professional credentials are prioritized. So what does all of this mean for you if you're currently planning to migrate to Australia, or if you're already here on a temporary visa hoping to transition to permanence? First, understand that the timelines for everything have blown out dramatically. With the complexity of the new system, processing times are extending. Visas that used to take 6 months are now taking 12 to 18 months. Permanent residence applications that might have taken a year are now taking 2 to 3 years. If you're planning to migrate, you need to add significant additional time to your projections, and you need to be prepared for that time to be filled with uncertainty as rules continue to evolve. Second, the costs have escalated beyond what most people anticipated. Visa application fees were already among the highest in the world, and they've been increased further under the new system. But it's not just the fees, it's the costs of meeting the new requirements. Additional English tests at premium prices because they must be taken at approved Australian centers. The Cultural Competency Program fees. Higher skill assessment costs. Legal fees because the complexity makes professional advice virtually essential. All told, migrating to Australia under the new system can easily cost $30,000 to $50,000 per family even before you arrive in the country, and that's if everything goes smoothly without rejections or appeals. Third, the uncertainty means that having backup plans is no longer optional, it's essential. If Australia is your only target, you're taking an enormous risk. The dynamic nature of the new system means that even if you qualify today, you might not qualify tomorrow. Looking at alternative destinations, maintaining eligibility for other countries' migration programs, ensuring you have options if your Australian pathway closes, this kind of contingency planning is now a necessary part of any migration strategy. Canada, New Zealand, and several European countries are actively liberalizing their migration systems even as Australia restricts, and for many people, these alternatives may offer more realistic and stable pathways. Fourth, if you're already in Australia on a temporary visa, the urgency to secure permanent residence has increased dramatically. The transitional provisions in the new system are minimal. In many cases, people who have been in Australia for years on temporary visas will find that they no longer meet the criteria for permanent residence under the new rules. If you have any pathway available under the current regulations, even if it means making compromises like accepting a job in a regional area or taking a position at a lower level than you'd prefer, seriously consider taking it now rather than waiting for ideal circumstances that may never materialize under the new system. Fifth, the importance of specialized professional advice has never been higher. The new system is so complex that attempting to navigate it without expert guidance is genuinely risky. But not all migration agents or lawyers are equally equipped to handle the new framework. Look for professionals who are actively engaging with the policy changes, who have track records of successful applications under the new system, and who are honest about your chances rather than simply taking your money and filing applications that have little prospect of success. Ask detailed questions about their success rates, request references from recent clients, and be wary of anyone who makes the process sound simple or guaranteed. The political dimension of these changes cannot be ignored. The selective migration system was introduced by a government responding to public pressure about housing affordability, infrastructure strain, and community concerns about rapid population growth concentrated in major cities. These are legitimate issues, but migration has become the convenient scapegoat for problems that are largely the result of underinvestment in infrastructure and housing supply. Opinion polling shows that while Australians generally support skilled migration in principle, there's growing anxiety about numbers and pace. The government is trying to thread this needle by being visibly tough on migration while still allowing enough inflow to meet business demands for labor. This political reality means that further restrictions are likely rather than liberalizations. Any government, regardless of political party, will face pressure to demonstrate control over migration numbers and to prioritize Australian workers. The days of Australia as a relatively easy destination for skilled migrants are definitively over. The country is moving toward a much more selective, managed, and restrictive approach that will significantly reduce overall migration numbers while trying to target very specific skills gaps. For individuals planning their futures, this means Australia should be viewed as a high-difficulty option requiring exceptional qualifications, significant financial resources, and considerable luck with timing. Here at Aussie Global Affairs, we'll continue tracking every development in Australia's migration system. We'll break down policy changes as they happen, provide detailed analyses of what they mean for different categories of applicants, share success stories and warning tales from real cases, and give you the strategic insights you need to navigate this increasingly complex landscape. The game has changed. The old rules are dead. And the new reality of Australian migration is harsher and more selective than most people realize. Subscribe to Aussie Global Affairs right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a critical update about Australian migration policy. These changes are happening fast, new regulations are being announced regularly, and staying informed could mean the difference between successfully migrating and having your plans collapse. Share this video with anyone you know who's considering Australia because they need to understand what they're really up against. Leave a comment telling me your situation, where you are in your migration journey, what concerns you most about these changes, and I'll try to point you toward resources and strategies that might help. The selective migration system is designed to keep most people out, but with the right knowledge, preparation, and timing, the door isn't completely closed. You just need to know exactly which door to push on and when.